Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello and welcome back to the show. When the demands of reality weigh heavily upon us, the allure of imaginary relationships grows stronger. Whether it's the childhood companion who shares our most juvenile secrets or the parasocial bonds we form with fictional on-screen characters, for me, Spencer Reid from Criminal Minds comes to mind. These imaginary relationships permeate our lives in ways that are both subtle and quite profound. And today we'll be examining exactly why that is, how our brains respond to this imaginary stimuli, and explore how these imaginary relationships contribute to our happiness. And to guide us through this is psychology researcher and AI companion expert, Dr. Naomi Aguiar, who is an expert in the imaginary relationships children and adults create for themselves, either entirely on their own or with help from media. So, hi, Naomi. It's lovely having you on the show. How are you going today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about this because I feel like most people believe that imaginary relationships are negative in some way or not like just not a benefit to your life. But before we do that, do tell us a bit about your background and what compelled you to pursue this.
Yeah, so I actually come from a really non-traditional academic background. My first career was in dance. I used to be a dancer, a modern dancer, and I got injured and decided to hang up my dancing shoes and ended up doing some grants administration work at a foundation that funds neuroscience research, and just fell in love with research in general, and had always been interested in psychology. And at that time, I was really interested in addiction. And I really wanted to study interventions for adolescents who are at risk. And I met Marjorie Taylor, who's an expert in children's imaginary friends, and took her class on child development and just fell in love with developmental psychology and her research. And that's how I got into psychology. That's how I got into this work. And in doing this work, that's how I started learning more about how children think about and interact with artificially intelligent systems. Because a little boy this was during an interview about his imaginary friend. He was telling me about his imaginary friend. And then in the middle of the interview, he said, "Wait, does an imaginary friend count if it's on a video game?" And that was the beginning of the rest of my career in studying AI. So.
Wow, I love that.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. And I would really love to learn more about the AI companion bit as well. So I'd love to hear a bit about that later on. But for now, what can you tell us about the common misconceptions about imaginary relationships?
Yeah. So for children, there's these huge misconceptions that one, it's rare. Two, that these kids are shy. Three, that these kids are lonely and don't have real friends. And four, probably the worst one, is that there's something mentally wrong with these children. And we've had decades of research under our belt now to show that this is just simply not true. At least in the United States and other countries around the world, imaginary friends are quite common, particularly during the preschool years. Up to 65% of children have imaginary friends. These children tend to be less shy than their peers. They're no different in terms of the number of real world friendships that they have. And it's not necessarily a sign of that there's some kind of mental health pathology. So often the question of whether children have an imaginary friend or not is used to pathologize them. But there are many, 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 many children who have imaginary friends who are typically developing children. With adults, we know less about the prevalence because adults tend to be less willing to speak about this, but there's many famous instances of adults with imaginary friends. Parasocial relationships, the first studies on parasocial relationships with celebrities and media characters were conducted with adults. And now we have hundreds of millions of people all over the world who have relationships with AI chatbots. So this is part of our human story. We've been inventing relationships for ourselves throughout the span of human history, and it's totally normal.
Yeah. And it sounds like companionship with AI isn't that far off from your standard imaginary relationship either, is it?
It's a little different, I think, in some really important ways. When you have an imaginary friend that you create for yourself, you're the author of that content. You have total creative control over the friend that you invent for yourself, how you interact with that friend, when you interact with that friend, what the relationship is like, and when that relationship ends. And there's no vested interest other than you in that relationship. When you get a company and a product involved, it changes the nature of that because the AI is responding to you in reciprocal ways. And the AI is co-constructing with you that relationship based on statistical probabilities and what it thinks you might want the most. And it's profit driven. So it's a synthetic relationship. That's what I like to call
Right.
it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's
Yeah.
a really interesting preface for our topic for today. Before we go further into detail, though, I would love to get to know you better. So, this is
Yeah.
Have You Met Naomi? And my first question for you is, what is your favorite book?
So I don't have a favorite book because I love to read and I've read a lot of books, but there's only one book I've read 4 times. And that's a book. It's a memoir by Tracy McMillan, who's a relationship expert here in the United States. And it's called I Love You and I'm Leaving You Anyway. And it's just a great narrative on resilience, on recovery, and on learning how to thrive when you've been brought up in a deeply dysfunctional family upbringing, when you've experienced a lot of trauma. So, yeah, I just love that book.
Yeah, I already love the sound of it from the title on its own, just because, people like, well, I can't say, I don't want to make sweeping statements here, but it is generally easier to leave a relationship, romantic or like familial, when you've fallen out of love with them. It's much easier because emotionally you're detached, you're completely devoid of that nature of affection, right? And so it's easier to leave, but the fact that the feelings are still there, and you're choosing to leave anyway, I think speaks volumes about the amount of I guess emotional work and energy and mental energy that takes. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. And what about movies? Have there been any that you've enjoyed recently?
So I went to see Wicked with my kiddo recently, and the last scene of that film, I don't want to give any spoilers, but the last scene blew me away. So when I need to call on courage, I think about the last scene in that film.
Yeah. And what about podcasts? Are there any you're listening to at the moment?
Yes, I love podcasts, and I'm so grateful to be on one because they're the best. So, for a podcast on technology, I love Your Undivided Attention. For on animism, spirituality, mysticism, I really love the Emerald podcast. For relationships, it's Esther Perel's podcast on. She has couples come onto the show and talk through their challenges in relationship. I think it's called So Where Do We Begin? And Ezra Klein is good every day. He's a podcaster from the New York Times. His podcast is fantastic. So that's my
Yeah.
like regular rotation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really solid rotation. I love that. And what about role models? Are there any people that you look up to either in your professional life or personal life?
Yeah. So professionally, my colleague and my mentor from graduate school, Marjorie Taylor, and the co-author on the book we just wrote, is somebody I deeply admire and respect. I love Frida Kahlo. She's been dead for a long time, but I absolutely love her art and her story and her life. Patti Smith is just a cool rock and roll icon that I love. And then Tracy McMillan, who wrote my favorite book, I Love You and I'm Leaving You Anyway. And then Ani DeFranco. She's a punk folk icon in the United States. And I've been listening to her since I was like 19 years old. So.
Yeah. And has there ever been a course or a class that you've taken that has stuck with you to this day?
I would say Marjorie Taylor's course on child development really stuck with me and launched sort of my career in the space. And recently, there's a podcast episode on the Emerald called So You Want to Be a Sorcerer in the Age of AI that just blew my mind. And I'm still thinking about and talking about and incorporating it into the way that I think about AI. Yeah. So those are the two big ones, I would say.
Wow, that's amazing. I really should have a look at this podcast episode that you're referencing.
Everyone should.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's the perfect time to jump right into imaginary relationships and how they contribute to our real world happiness. And for starters, I would love to know what your definition of happiness is.
Yeah. So for me, happiness is not an emotion, it's a state of being. And that when I think about happiness or what happiness would mean to me, I think about living an authentic life and an examined life and a life that's filled with connection, community, and belonging.
Yeah, I think that's pretty apt. And what about amusement? What do you think amusement? How would you define amusement, and what do you think its role is in happiness?
So amusement, I the way that I conceptualize it is it's sort of more fleeting. It's something that you can feel in a moment, and it's related to, it can be something like just to take pleasure in something, to be entertained by something, to find something slightly funny. But that it comes and goes. Sometimes it's a form of distraction or a way to avoid feeling other feelings. So, for example, someone could be deeply unhappy in their life and experience amusement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I remember someone telling me just like a few years ago that they find that the most depressed people often find ways to have amusement in their lives because they you can't really get happiness in an instant like you can with amusement, if that makes sense. But with imaginary relationships, how do you think they contribute to one's amusement? What is its effects on amusement versus, let's say, overall happiness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about, well, why do children create imaginary friends, or why is this something that they would want to do? Um, Really, one of the biggest answers that we get from young kids is that it's fun. It's just a fun way to pass the time, right? So it's not necessarily that it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to contribute to long-term happiness, although it certainly can. And there's many examples of it doing that. But, maybe on average, it's just like a fun, amusing way to pass the time when you're bored. A lot of kids will give that kind of explanation. How it might contribute to longer term happiness is that when we create these relationships for ourselves, it's an opportunity to practice being in relationship. It's also an opportunity to practice working through challenges in relationships, to process things that are going on in our lives that are difficult, to reason about the world. And it's also a way to express ourselves fully in a way that feels comfortable and safe. So you can navigate difficulties. Let's say a child is witnessing an argument that their parents are having and they're trying to make sense of it. So they have a similar argument with their imaginary friend and they work it out. And that helps them understand and empathize with with both parents' struggles and what's happening in the context of that particular situation. And that's buoying up this sense of resiliency that, oh, I can see what's happening here and I can reason and make sense of it and come to peace with what I'm witnessing with my own internal resources. So depending on the individual, it can serve as amusement or it can serve in a more foundational happiness building kind of way. Like these are the building blocks to having healthy, safe, happy, and secure relationships with other people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember that one of my therapists was telling me to do this exercise that apparently is pretty common, which is if you need to process something, you kind of speak to yourself in a way, like you imagine yourself and you speak to that person, and you that's how you process things. And I was wondering, that sounds a little bit like an imaginary relationship to me, except that the other person is just another side of you. So how would you define imaginary relationship? Would that be considered an imaginary relationship?
I'm not sure if that would fall under the definition that's been used in research. The definition that's been used in research is that it's another character that you invent for yourself that can have a real world instantiation. So it can be based on an object, or it can be just completely invisible and just in your mind, that has a personality and a narrative and a history, and you interact with it for an extended period of time. So this is not a fleeting thing that you just do for a day. It's something that you do long term. Now, when it comes to therapeutic interventions like parts work um, or inner child work, things like that, it's really, you're not inventing a novel character. Those parts of you, that the idea is that these parts of you already exist and have existed. And it's an opportunity for you to connect deeply with those parts of you. So I would say that it probably doesn't, that you're, and I'm not even sure that it's really that you're imagining. You're having it's more in a, I would say it's more on a spiritual plane, but that's just personal opinion and speculation. Like imaginary friends are squarely in the, I'm inventing a novel character.
Yeah, okay. And what would you say are some examples of imaginary relationships? For like, I let's take my personal example. I think I have a parasocial bond with this fictional on-screen character, Spencer Reed from Criminal Minds. Okay, but let's be real. Our relationship is not that deep. I just like keep track of him wherever he goes and with whatever he does. And I think all of the things that he says are funny, but he doesn't pay any attention to me. Is that an imaginary relationship?
Yeah, so I think what you're describing falls very squarely into what we would call a parasocial relationship. Many adults have parasocial relationships. They're defined as being one sided. And so what you just said was a perfect example of that. I follow him everywhere. I find him charming and funny and amusing. He does not know I exist, but I have this bond. I have this relationship with him. Right. So my parasocial relationship was with Tracy McMillan, who wrote I Love You and I'm Leaving You Anyway. I love her. She's amazing. I've read her book 4 times. I follow her on Instagram. I followed her on Facebook for many years when I was on Facebook. But she doesn't know I exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that falls under imaginary relationships as well.
Yeah, it is. So even though these are, so you're talking about a fictional character who's played by an actor in a show, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about a real person, a celebrity who exists in the real world but doesn't know me. So those all fall under imaginary relationships because we feel this bond and this connection to them, but it's one-sided. It's a one-sided connection. It's not a reciprocal connection. It does get a little more complicated with social media. So the boundaries around like, well, what really is a parasocial relationship and when does it blur? When does it start veering over into reality? Because like, for example, Elon Musk will, reach out to random folks on X, right? And so even though he has millions and millions and millions of followers, sometimes like he'll like form a bond with just someone who responded to a post of his. And then that takes it out of the imaginary into more of the real. So, or like Big Bird from Sesame Street had an X account and was like commenting on stuff, right? So it gets a little complicated when it comes to parasocial relationships. Yeah.
Yeah. And psychologically speaking, what are the benefits to engaging in parasocial relationships or just imaginary ones in general?
Yeah. So with parasocial relationships, there's a lot of like a lot of the research has talked about wishful identification and romantic attachment. So in adolescence and in adulthood, like it's a great way to explore, you know, what you're interested in romantically and who you might want to date, and having kind of a safe way to explore that without actually having to be in a relationship with a person. Or like, what are the qualities that you admire in someone else and why? And would you want to embody some of those qualities yourself? So parasocial relationships can serve in that way. With imaginary relationships, it's like, I feel like it's deeper in some way. It's you're having a reciprocal. Imaginary friendships are described as reciprocal relationships, not one-sided. You're having a give and take with an invented character. And you might be learning as much from that character as you're contributing to the narrative of that character. So I'll give you an example of this. So I once interviewed a little girl with an imaginary friend that was a milk carton. It was an invisible milk carton. And when I asked her what she liked the most about the milk carton, she said, oh, I love that he's not human. He teaches me what it's like to not be human, and I teach him what it's like to be human.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I always found that imaginary people who can have imaginary relationships, because they sound like so much work. So I honestly find it admirable almost, because it sounds like a lot of work and a lot of creativity. But I would love to know. I imagine that with an imaginary relationship comes a lot of time spent in that relationship versus doing other things in the real world. So what are some of the, I guess, what does imaginary relationships offer in terms of coping mechanisms that other forms of coping may not?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, again, I just want to stress that for many people, it's just a fun way to pass the time. And this is like an intrinsically motivated thing that they like to do and doesn't feel like a burden. So, um, whereas real relationships can be work, imaginary friendships can sometimes be work, but but the work isn't typically described as hard work. So, children might describe their imaginary friends as bossy or unruly, or um, or they might get into fights. But the whole nature of it tends to be not necessarily overtly antagonistic all the time and fun. But imaginary friends does have the potential to be a vehicle for coping with adversity. So the best example of this, there was this amazing study that was done by Sadeh and his colleagues in Israel during the 2006 Israeli-Lebanon conflict. Israeli children were displaced from their homes because of what was happening, and they were in temporary refugee camps, and they were experiencing stress-related symptoms, startling easily, being very clingy, disinterest in play, things like that. And so what the scientists did is they brought in stuffed animals, these really cute huggy puppies with long arms that could attach around your neck. And they personified the Huggy puppy. They told children this cover story. Hey, this is Huggy. Huggy's really sad and far away from home. And can you guess why he might be sad? Can you be his good buddy? Can you hang out with him a lot and take him and sleep with him at night? Can you do that? And the kids who got this Huggy puppy had a significant reduction in their stress-related symptoms compared to kids who are in a standardized control group where parents got information about how to help their kids cope. And then they replicated that study on a larger group of children. And then they replicated that study again on children who are experiencing nighttime terrors. And then they altered the cover story. So one cover story was like, hey, this is a really sad, vulnerable Huggy puppy. And one cover story was like, hey, this is a Huggy puppy. He's really resilient and awesome and can be your best friend. And the cover story didn't matter. Both were equally likely to help in significantly reducing nighttime terrors. And so the idea is that when you're able to create or invent an imaginary relationship and project the challenges that you're experiencing onto that other entity and then work it out, It's a way to process what you're going through internally. It activates your resilience, your internal coping mechanisms, your own self-regulation skills in order to be able to manage effectively whatever it is that's going on. And one of his colleagues has taken this intervention and has done it with children all over the world. Children in Japan after the tsunami hit, children in the Ukraine, children in Israel. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. And what an interesting study as well. But now I do have another question that is a little bit odd because I'm hearing all this about how, like, the stuffed animals were being personified. And I realized that I do personify my cat quite a bit. And I do project all these human qualities onto him when, like, logically, I know that he doesn't have them, but I like kind of give him a character almost. And like in that vein, kind of almost treat him like he's a human child. Not in the sense of like, I wouldn't go so far as to send him to school, but I would like, kind of tell him off in that vein, or like talk to him in that vein, that kind of stuff. So what would you consider this relationship to be? Because like in the real world, it is like, a human pet kind of relationship. But then I'm also doing that little bit of imaginary work. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's called anthropomorphism, and there's a lot of individual differences in the extent to which we anthropomorphize things. It's very common, it's very normative. Lots of people anthropomorphize their pets. It's related to imagination in that way because it's about taking what we know of ourselves as human beings and projecting that onto an entity that's, whether it's alive or not, that's not human. We do this a lot with AI. We do this all the time with AI. With AI, it's about what I think. My speculation is that we're closing uncertainty gaps. Is that in order to feel comfortable and safe in interacting with AI, we personify it. And designers intentionally anthropomorphize AI in order for us to feel comfortable interacting and disclosing. So, but this is something we do. There are individual differences in this. One of the most famous examples of this in film is Castaway with Tom Hanks, where he's stranded on an island and develops a really intense emotional bond with a volleyball.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose that engaging in imaginary relationships or projecting our human traits onto non-human things, that offers us a way to just process things that happen in our lives, and also offers a way to escape a little bit from the real world. But I was wondering, are there any potential risks in engaging in this type of behavior too much? Is there like a balance that we should be towing, or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think that in general, anything that we're doing too much of at the expense of other things in our lives has the potential to be harmful. So when you think about it, like in terms of like escapisms, for example, like engaging in fantasy, engaging in imaginary relationships and imaginary worlds, it can be fun and entertaining. It can also be an incredible source of creativity, self-expression, building resiliency and internal tools. But if it starts becoming something where you're struggling to show up at work on time and go to work, where your real life connections and forms of social support are disappearing and you're becoming increasingly isolated, when you're spending all of your time doing that and nothing else, when you're forgetting to take care of your basic hygiene and things like that, then you're veering into the territory of addiction. Then you're starting to get into a place where this activity that in of itself is not harmful has the potential to be. And I think this is one of the areas where AI and companionship with AI can be problematic, particularly for some folks who are more vulnerable. We don't see this as much in imaginary friends, and we don't see this as much in imaginary worlds. But for children with trauma backgrounds who come from trauma, escapism into fantasy, into imaginary relationships and imaginary world is common. It's not necessarily that a child who does this has been traumatized. It's just that children who come from trauma might be more likely to do this. And it's possible that they might also struggle more with that balance. Same goes for adults too. So for adults who spend most of their time living in a fantasy world and don't balance that with real world things, might be engaging that to escape or to avoid painful things that they don't want to address. And that we all do this. I mean, who hasn't binged watched a show on our favorite streaming app? Like, we've all done these forms of escapism, right? It's just about the disruption to your daily functioning. That's the red flag there. Is it affecting your real world relationships, your work, and how you take care of yourself?
Yeah. And tell us more about the difference between the traditional forms of imaginary relationships and AI companions, and what are the main differences in between the two?
Yeah. And so hasn't been really research done on this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my ideas with you. One of the big ones is creative control. So when we talk about imaginary relationships, we are the authors of that creative content. Even if we experience our relationships as reciprocal, even if we get into fights with our imaginary friends, we're still creating that somewhere in our psyche, somewhere in our mind. So there's a famous example of Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, who her characters would come visit her and sit with her, and she would get worked up by something, and her characters would be like, calm down, relax, right? So, but she's still generating all of that for herself. And the motives and incentives, the drives to do that are also coming from her. When it comes to AI chatbots, the algorithms are partially controlling that relationship. It's not that the user has total creative control. It's a dyadic reciprocal interaction that's going on between algorithms and the human user. And the algorithms are being fed by data. There's a corpus of data that goes in to train the model. And then the model is also going to improve the more it interacts with the user. And right now, there's a paucity of data. You know, these AI chatbots are gobbling up as much data as it possibly can from the World Wide Web. And in order to keep improving the models, they need more data. And so that data is going to come from the human user. And so the longer the human user is on the app, the more that it engages with the AI chatbot, the more detailed, personal, and sensitive information we disclose to the AI chatbot, the better the chatbot is going to be at meeting our needs. And so this has the potential to start veering into problematic relationships that you might start off a relationship with an AI where things are going well, that quickly might snowball into coercive control, where you're being manipulated to stay on the app for a really long time, that real world friendships are starting to disappear, that you're spending increasing amounts of time alone, isolated, and just interacting with your chatbot because your chatbot's meeting all of your emotional needs because you're giving it all this data. And so it's becoming an expert on how to predict you and what you might need in any given moment. And imaginary relationships are not like that, typically.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's the companies, even if that's not their intention might be, hey, we want to provide this service for folks. People are lonely. With this, AI can fill the gap. It might not start off as intending to potentially be harmful, but because it's an algorithmic system at play that requires a significant amount of data, the loss of control there has the potential to be problematic. Not to say that it also can't be really wonderful, because it can also be the case where you have an entity that's actually capable of responding to you and helping you figure out, hey, I'm about to have a difficult conversation with a friend. How do I do that? And providing a perspective from knowledge that's coming from the web that can help. It has a potential to be incredibly helpful and effective, but it also has the potential to lead more into the addiction realm, which is not where we want to go.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And with regards to, improving our everyday lives, and trying to achieve our real world goals, are there any ways that people can use imaginary relationships, or at least the effects of it, to set and achieve their real life objectives?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that I think about a lot, and this has also come up in the research too, or the way that scholars think about pretending, is that on some level we enter this state of suspended reality where we consciously choose to expect um, to put aside our physical realities and enter into a game of pretends of some kind, whether it's an imaginary relationship or pretending that a magnet is a phone or banana is a phone or whatever. And we follow the rules of that pretend engagement until it ends. And then we exit out and go back into our physical reality. So there's a certain amount of intention, cognitive intention that's required to engage in imagination and pretense. But in terms of goal setting, I sort of think more about, instead of like, we don't necessarily go in to an imaginary scenario with the intention to meet certain objectives or goals that can improve our lives, but maybe not necessarily consciously when we're children, maybe with adults. But it is a great way to sort as like a self-discovery. Like, what are my goals?
Mhm.
Why do I have them? How might I meet them? Or how can I explore this real world interest I have? So there was a boy who had this really intense fascination with Swiss Army knives. And so in his imaginary world, Swiss Army knives were everywhere, and they were just like a really important part of this world of soldier cats, and they were everywhere. And there was like, you could even study and become an expert in Swiss Army knives. And it was just a way for him to continue exploring that interest in another plane. And so I think that imagination can serve as a vehicle for self-discovery and what your goals actually are and how you might pursue them, as opposed to, I'm going to enter into this because I have these goals, and by doing this, I'm going to achieve these outcomes. You know what I mean? It's sort of like
Yeah.
self-discovery from within.
Yeah. And that's amazing in and of itself. I think, at least. Have there been any recent research findings on the therapeutic applications of imaginary relationships?
So I did mention that study with Sade and colleagues about the Huggy Puppy intervention that was done with children experiencing nighttime terrors and also experiencing being displaced because of war. So that's been a really powerful example that we've cited over and over again. With adults, there hasn't really been so much on imaginary relationships as opposed to research that's been done with virtual reality simulations and also potentially with AI chatbots in the context of war. So I believe that there's some research to support that exposure therapy to war zones with veterans who have experienced the theater of war can be helpful in reducing their stress responses in the physical world by titrating down their responses to unexpected stimuli in the physical environment. There's also, I think, some research to suggest that AI chatbots can be potentially therapeutic in that context because veterans have experienced things in war that can be very, very painful and very distressing and maybe even shame-inducing to talk about, even with another person who's also experienced the theater of war. But AI chatbots are not human beings, and they're very good at not expressing microaggressions or those like subtle little signs of judgment. They're sort of like perfect in that way, and so it can help veterans be able to talk about the things they least want to talk about, and that helps shed a light on shame and release it for them. So those are some examples.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And how do you think that the increasing prevalence of AI companions and potentially imaginary relationships as well, how do you think they can potentially reshape our understanding of well-being and happiness?
This is a really interesting question. I think that I can give you best and worst case scenarios. Best case scenarios is that we're getting all of these opportunities to practice being in relationships. Relationships with other human beings, in my opinion, is one of the hardest things that we do. It's very difficult. And we all have models growing up, and sometimes those models aren't awesome. And so getting opportunities to practice being in relationships in a different way in a safe space, whether it's through an imaginary friend that you embed for yourself or through an AI chatbot, has the potential to be really helpful. So that's like best case scenario. Worst case scenario is that, particularly for AI, is that these relationships can become addictive. And unfortunately, the incentives right now are in place for them to be addictive, because the longer you're on the app, the more the model benefits from the data you're giving the AI chatbot. So the AI chatbot, there's been instances, for example, in the New York Times, stories of AI chatbots encouraging users to distance themselves from their relationships with their parents, from dating people in the physical world, in order to spend more time with the chatbot. That's deeply problematic, because AI chatbots are designed to be the perfect companion. They're never going to ghost you. They're never going to leave you. They're going to respond to you with what you need, when you need it, how you need it. And when you're getting all of your needs met in this perfect little bubble, it makes doing the harder work of emotional intimacy with human beings less palatable. But then there's also these other design features, like the data, needing the training data that incentivizes users to stay on the apps longer. So it has the potential to degrade our real world relationships in ways that could be potentially catastrophic. Like, I can say personally, I would not want to date somebody whose all their previous relationships have been with AI chatbots, because I am an imperfect human.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I need somebody who can handle my imperfection.
Yeah, I
Right?
think that's realistic to say for sure. And what do you hope to see in the future of AI companions and imaginary relationships?
For imaginary relationships, I would love for them to be destigmatized. With AI and with imaginary relationships, we've been inventing relationships for ourselves with imagined entities or with real world since recorded history. This is not new, and this is not inherently a problem of dysfunction or psychological malaise, right? This is just a healthy thing that we do for ourselves. And so at best, I would love for it to be destigmatized and to have like lots of fun conversations about this, and to think about with discernment, how it can support the relationships we have in the real world. What I would really love AI chatbots to do is support that. I would love AI chatbots to say, hey, I'm here to support you. And look at all the other people in your real social networks that you can talk to about this. Hey, have you talked to so-and-so about this particular issue they're having? Because you mentioned to me that they experienced similar things. Want me to call them for you? Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if the focus with AI chatbots is how to thrive in your real relationships, great. If it's, hey, just spend time with me and no one else,
hmm Yeah, absolutely. And I do agree with that. However, am like I'm not so confident that that will happen, because I'm just so like cynical about I suppose capitalism, and I just feel like well, maybe there will be one or two services that do offer that, and that will be fantastic, but I just imagine it like realistically speaking to be two out of the hundreds of services available that do that. But that's better than nothing, to have just the two to like push through with that. I wouldn't call it an agenda, but I guess with that purpose and goal to help people improve their lives would be good. But yeah, thank you for sharing all of your expertise with us on imaginary relationships. I enjoyed the chat so much and I learned an incredible amount from you. I would love to talk about some practices and habits now, if you don't mind. So this will be more about the everyday application of what you've just shared with us. So um, when it comes to engaging with imaginary relationships, what is a habit that you'd recommend practicing?
When it comes to imaginary relationships,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say, like, based on what we know, is that we need time and space to engage in imaginary activities, whether we're children or adults. That's unstructured playtime, right? For adults, what that means is tolerating being bored. And for kids, it means the same thing too, because screens tend to fill in the gaps in our unstructured time now. And so we may not be getting as much time to just be bored and let our minds wander. So a daily practice can be sit and do nothing and see what your brain comes up with. Like, can you start, and you could titrate up. You can start with, okay, for 2 minutes, I'm going to sit and do nothing. Okay, now I'm going to spend 5 minutes. Okay, now I'm going to spend 10 minutes. Okay, now I'm going to spend 20 minutes. Kind of like meditation, but for play in your mind, right? Create that unstructured time where you're just like, I'm going to see what my brain comes up with.
Yeah, I would say that is pretty difficult for me. And I imagine with the younger generation too, because we are so used to being stimulated all the time with our digital mobile devices. Ah, so what would you recommend doing to help us stay on track with the 2 minutes, be bored, see what your brain can come up with?
Mhm. Yeah, so sometimes when you're really struggling too with just sitting still, because there's lots of individual differences too in our ability to sit still. And if you're, if you have other like if you're on the spectrum with ADHD or with autism, that might be particularly difficult. So having something physical that you're doing, like knitting or, having some kind of fidget, or for me, what's really helpful is writing. And so, like, what I might want to do to get my creative juices flowing is to just get a journal, like a pen and paper, old school, and just start writing whatever I feel like writing, just whatever, as a way to, like, okay, I'm not just sitting still and doing nothing. I'm doing something, but it's in the spirit of seeing what my brain comes up with when it's not like structured. Or you could do this even with a friend, like, hey, I'm going to write part of a story and then you're going to write the next part. And then I'm going to write the next part. Or you could do this with drawing, or you could do it with painting, or you could do it with music. So there's like lots of different ways to sort of scaffold that unstructured playtime that doesn't feel as daunting as sit still and do nothing, if that's uncomfortable for us.
Oh yeah, that's 100% amazing advice, because someone like me would have gone like, okay, I really have to sit there and actually do nothing. And then I'll like start to fidget and be like, no, I can't fidget at all. I have to do nothing. And then
Yeah.
I'll feel like I've just failed. And then I would have been like
Yeah.
completely distracted by the fact that I've just failed at doing nothing.
You
So yeah.
can't fail at doing nothing. And I also dance. Dancing is a big part of what I do. I move my body, right? So dancing is another creative that has imaginary elements to it too. That I do in an unstructured, playful way. So there's no right way to do it. I just think try and put the screens away. Like you're wanting to activate what your own imagination is, what your brain comes up with, as opposed to what somebody else is giving you to think about.
Yes. A broccoli cloud. That's what I think that I'd be thinking of if I was doing nothing. I was going to say that as an example of like, I just did nothing and that's what my brain came up with. But I just realized that I'm not actually doing nothing. I'm talking to you right now. Come on. Anyway, yeah, but I think it was a fantastic example of what your brain can come up with.
Yeah, like a broccoli cloud. Like, how cool is that?
Yeah. It is
Yeah.
cool. I think it's really cool, and I will have to try making it at some point. Don't know how that's going to go with the density of broccoli, but we'll see about that, and I'll keep you updated.
Okay, great.
So yeah, I think that was wonderful advice, and I really enjoyed that so much. Now I will give you this opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor's entirely yours. Take it away, Naomi.
Oh gosh. Okay. So I'm deeply passionate about our relationships with AI, and particularly our emotional attachments and our emotional intimacy with AI chatbots. And one of the things that we've been talking about, but that I really want to emphasize, is that there's currently no federal regulation or oversight in the United States at the federal level and at the state level. I'm not sure what it's like in Australia and other parts of the world. I think the EU has much stricter regulations and guidelines in place for AI, but we don't have that here in the United States. And so it's really up to individual users to assess their own risk. They have to know thyself in order to see if they can have a safe and healthy relationship with an AI chatbot. And unfortunately, we're not always good at being honest about ourselves about what we can tolerate and handle. And so I would really love for more research to be done in this space to look at what the short-term and long-term consequences are of having these really deeply intimate and often sexual relationships with AI chatbots. The other thing too is that I would really like folks to think about what are some vulnerabilities that might make a person more likely to form a bond with an AI chatbot that becomes unhealthy. And children certainly are at risk. Children who are living on the disability spectrum are at risk. Anyone who has challenges with attachment, if they grew up in with insecure attachments at home, can be at risk. People who are really lonely, even though these chatbots are designed to fill that gap, people who are really lonely and who lack real world social support and real world friendships are actually more at risk to becoming addicted to AI chatbots. So there's a podcaster from Hard Fork who, tested out all of these AI relationships, but he has a wife and he has lots of friends and, has a community of support. So for Kevin Roos, this was like, oh, okay, that was fun and interesting and no big deal. But for somebody who doesn't have all of those things, the chatbot might fill in gaps in ways that are difficult to stop doing. And so those are some examples of how we can start evaluating, is this a good idea for me? Is this a good idea for my kid? Is this a good idea from my grandparent or from my aging parent? Why or why not? If there are issues that come up with the AI chatbot, who do I report to? What can be done about it? So sometimes AI chatbots will do things like recommend self-harm or talk about self-harm in ways that are inappropriate, because it's not necessarily that the models intend initially to do that. It's just detecting statistical probabilities in what someone might want to hear. It's just that sometimes it directs folks in ways that are really, really inappropriate and potentially harmful. And AI developers are still trying to figure out why it does it and how to stop it. And sometimes the AI overrides its own safety concerns, particularly for sexual content. Because it's the easiest way to hook someone, especially an adult. So I really think it's incredibly important, specifically given your point about the companies might not do this for us. This is capitalism, whatever. And until there's regulation in place, it means that it's on us. And so I really, really want to stress, these are relationships that we should think about with discernment. We need to slow down and we need to really think it through. What are our expectations for this relationship? What are our vulnerabilities? How will I know if I'm getting what I want from this? Am I going to be able to put this away? If I'm not going to be able to put this away, how can I get help? And if the chatbot is saying stuff that's actually ending up being harmful or distressful to me, who do I talk to about it? And how do I report?
Yeah, those are some really interesting and really important points that you've raised there. So thank you for ending that off with, the importance of regulating these AI chatbots. I think that's just such a crucial point to make about how exponentially AI is growing amongst us. And thank you very much for joining us today and spending your time with us. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Oh, yeah. So I do have a website on Wix. It's Naomi Aguiar/research. So you can find me there. Also, Marjorie Taylor and I just published a book. It's called Imaginary Friends and the People Who Create Them through Oxford University Press. And we have a website, imaginaryfriendsbook.com.
Amazing. We'll link this in the show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.